We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar tonight. My name is Leslie Babinski, and I'm the director of the Center for Child and Family Policy at Duke University. And on behalf of this center, I'd like to welcome you all to the Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture Series. The Center for Child and Family Policy sponsors the Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture Series to engage our community, including Duke faculty, research scientists, staff, the Durham community, the Triangle region, and now, thanks to our virtual reach, folks from across the United States. This series features experts who've demonstrated excellence in behavioral science and theory, as well as science to policy applications. These lectures are made possible through an endowment from the Arthur Sulzberger family. And I'd like to take a moment now to recognize and thank Cynthia Sulzberger and her husband, Stephen Green, who are joining us for the webinar tonight. Cindy and Stephen, we're so appreciative of the support that your family has given to sponsor great lectures like this one tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that the discussion will last about 45 minutes. And after that, we're going to have time for questions. So as you're listening to the discussion today, if you could please type your questions into the Q&A function. We'll be looking at those to pull some of your questions for our discussion from the audience. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Denise Forte for this afternoon's Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture. With more than 2 decades of experience in federal legislative and executive branches, Denise Forte brings strategic leadership to the Education Trust efforts to engage policymakers and diverse coalitions of advocates in demanding and securing equity-advancing policy change at the national and state levels. Prior to her work at the Education Trust, Ms. Forte was a senior fellow and director of public affairs for the Century Foundation, which is a progressive think tank. She also spent 20 years in progressively senior congressional staff roles, including staff director for the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. She also served in the Obama administration in the U.S. Department of Education, where she held positions of principal, deputy assistant secretary, and acting assistant secretary in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. I'm proud to say that Ms. Forte graduated from Duke University with a BS in computer science, as well as a master's degree in women's studies from the George Washington University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Denise. And everyone join me in welcoming Denise Forte.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just delighted to be with everybody today. We are going to do a little different format for you than a traditional lecture. As is the way of the Education Trust, we are really focused on making sure that advocacy benefits from research and data in order to make policy change. And so I have 2 of my colleagues on the stage with me today who we're going to tell the story together. So again, thank you for having us and inviting us. So as was shared, my name is Denise Forte. I am the interim CEO at the Education Trust, which is a national research and advocacy organization working to close opportunity gaps for students of color and students from low-income households. You know, I always enjoy getting a chance to speak with folks in North Carolina. It was my home for 7 years, first attending Duke, and then later going on to work in Clemens outside of Winston-Salem. And through the Education Trust, I've also had a number of opportunities to work with amazing folks on the ground in North Carolina, educators, advocates, business leaders, who are doing amazing work in their communities to ensure that underserved children have access to a high quality education. I'm also very proud to be on the board of the Hunt Institute. Governor Hunt, I've always been a huge fan, and I've really enjoyed being able to focus more intentionally around their work of creating really well-informed elected leaders who can also understand research and data and its impact on education policy. I really wish I could be joining you in person. One of the things that has been tough about doing virtual events, especially for North Carolina, is that I can't go grab a biscuit at Biscuitville, which I loved, and sadly probably had too many biscuits. if you can have too many biscuits from there. And of course, I was really looking forward to picking up more and newer Duke swag for me and my family. They're well dressed in a lot of Blue Devils stuff. But my boys, 9 and 13, grow bigger every day. So I wanted to share just a little bit about, my personal story. As I mentioned earlier, we at the Education Trust, at our core, we're making sure that the work goes into policy development and implementation. From the research we do to the advocates we support on the issues that we focus on, first and foremost, our focus is on students and the students who are most impacted. Policy about the people is what drew me to Education Trust, because it's really been a core value of who I am as I grew up. My father was the son of a sharecropper from Texas. He always knew his calling to serve. He rose from his upbringing in the segregated South to become a general in the Army. And then in post-retirement, he became an assistant superintendent of schools in Fairfax County, Virginia. And when I think about my father's service in the school district, I keep coming back to two things. Let's move some slides. Sorry, I skipped over a few things. Next slide, please. And one more slide. And one more slide. The slide thing always get me. There you go. Perfect. But one of the two things that keep coming back to me when I think about my dad, and especially his work in the school district with students, were Cheerios and strawberries. My father had Cheerios and strawberries for breakfast almost every day in post-retirement. And I love this picture because it just really evokes my father. And at that time, when he was an assistant superintendent, one of the things that he noticed was that not all of the schools in the system were providing school breakfast. And he knew the evidence, like children cannot learn if they arrive at the school door hungry. We know what good nutrition means and its impact on education and academic achievement. He made it a point to visit every single school in the system. And even to this day, I have former principals, former teachers, when they hear that I'm Johnny Fort's daughter, they said, your dad came to my school at least once a month. So he was on the road a lot, and Fairfax County is a big system. And so one year, I can remember him telling me this story about this little boy who he met, a little African-American boy, and he got to know really well and sort of became his mentor, but he also would have breakfast with him. And so I can still picture my father sitting on a chair much too small for him, eating Cheerios and strawberries with this little boy. And he did that and recognized the power of breakfast, and therefore then decided to bring it system-wide in talking to the child about his experience at home. And that really just sort of impacted me. And there are other stories like that about the way he listened and the power of that listening, and how even in that listening, he was advocating and doing service. And he was making sure that it would bring impact to the people that he really cared about, which were the students. You do for others was the motto he lived by, breathed, and imparted to me. And I've carried that on through my life. That's been my motto in the work that I do in policy and when I was on Capitol Hill. And in fact, my transition from the world of tech to education policy was also driven by a need to have more impact on my community, service through volunteering, obviously, and eventually moving into policy on Capitol Hill allowed me to do that. And by working for two of the most amazing members of Congress, one is still there, I was able to delve into policy issues and lead agendas that were focused on children and families, child nutrition, juvenile justice reform, education for children experiencing homelessness, higher education affordability. I took that with me to the Obama administration, where I was able to lead budget development with that lens, with the support of an amazing team. And so I think when we think of how research and policy comes together, this motto of you do for others actually is quite impactful. If policy at its core is about people, then research to inform people and inform policy must be about improving the lives of those most impacted by the policy. And to drive that impact, we need effective and evidence-based policy. And this is what EdTrust does. We connect the people and the evidence to the policy decision makers and the policy decisions. And we think about what is so crucial in this moment as we continue to live through and look toward recovery from the pandemic. We have such an urgent calling to bring research, to bring the evidence-based solutions to students who've been impacted the most. And the data is out there. I'm sure many of you are actively studying this, but the data are really showing just how much the pandemic has interrupted student learning. And while student performance data show that all students honestly have been affected by the pandemic, the impact is far greater for some student populations, and in particular, students of color and students from low income backgrounds. I had the pleasure of being on a panel with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading this week, third grade level reading, and they had researchers from McKinsey, NWEA, and Curriculum Associates sharing with us what the numbers look like over the past year. Math and reading were both impacted, those scores. Math, much so more than reading. Our youngest learners have deep unfinished learning, and the reading scores show that. NEA said, for example, Black third grade reading achievement had declined by 10 percentile points this year relative to previous years, compared to 5 points for white students. And math achievement for these third graders declined by 14 points, compared to 7 points for white students. McKinsey, gaps continue to widen. Students in majority Black schools remain 5 months behind their historical levels in both math and reading, while students in majority white schools are now just 2 months behind. These disruptions are alarming when you consider that schools serving Black and Latino students were 9 months behind their peers in majority white schools. And then what do we know here in North Carolina? Well, 53% of 8th graders were proficient in math in 2018-19, compared to just 33% this school year. This data show how few that schools were not supporting enough students of color, students from low income backgrounds, in accelerating their learning. For English learners, students with disabilities, in order to reach those 8th grade or those grade level proficiencies. So we know this unfinished learning is not only about the pandemic, and it's real, but it is also due to systemic inequities, including underfunded schools, schools who've been struggling to adapt to virtual technology, facing technology barriers, spending more time reviewing old content. And then there's communities of color who have just been disrupted by the pandemic and its impact on health and economics and the economy. But at the same time, we at the Education Trust, Lynn and Eric, who I'll be introducing soon, we see this as one of tremendous opportunity, because too often evidence-based practices shift in our schools and districts are hindered by a lack of resources. But with the new recovery funding coming from the government, we have a big chance to make a significant and sustainable impact on the lives of the students who have been most impacted. So at the Education Trust, we've been advocating for school, district, and state leaders to use these federal funds to accelerate rather than remediate. Accelerate rather than remediate student learning by spending these dollars on evidence-based strategy. And the work that we have done and that we help to bring to advocates so that they too can make these demands The research shows that targeted intensive tutoring, when implemented well, can help underserved students to catch up and meet high standards. Some key elements include having a tutor with experience. While we might want everybody to have the benefit of a teacher, you can get college students, you can get AmeriCorps, you can get grandparents. Honestly, with the right training, the professional development, making sure it is aligned with what the students are already learning in school, we can get that done. You expand tutoring over the whole school year. Small tutoring groups, very small teacher to student ratio is really important. And making sure that they have the same tutor, so that's not disruptive. The other things that we've been thinking about is, what about expanded learning time? Can we change the way the schedule is blocked so that they have the ability to expand the amount of hours that our students are learning, but also let's make it fun. What about during the summer? The impact of summer learning is also great, but all of these different programs and all the ways that they can be delivered really need to be done with intentionality. And I would argue, and something that we've been talking about a lot, with this influx in money, the $200 billion that came in over the last couple of years, schools and systems have the opportunity to invest in the infrastructure of those programs, in professional development. If you're going to be using computers to help you do the tutoring, those type of infrastructure needs that can carry on well beyond when the money ends, and there will be a cliff. So using that money well right now is really important. And another thing that's been really overlooked, but the Education Trust did significant research on this with partners, is for students who have been underserved, building and maintaining strong relationships between students and educators is so critically important. Mental health needs that we are seeing of our young people at all ages is at its highest. And if we can build these relationships, parents, teachers, grandparents, with students and with the school system, that's how we will be able to manage and help and support students in grappling with the economic toll of the pandemic, a nationwide reckoning on racism, food and housing insecurities, and potentially the grief of losing a family member to COVID. We have a moral and economic responsibility to meet this moment, focus on accelerated learning, and keep students at the heart of our recovery efforts. And that's what it's all about for us. So one of our biggest needs, we know, is ensuring that students are taught by effective and well-supported teachers. And this requires a strong and diverse teacher workforce. I really want to salute the governor for taking on this initiative here in North Carolina, along with a number of partners, including the Hunt Institute. The evidence is clear that access to a racially and culturally diverse teacher workforce is beneficial for all students, from preschool through high school graduation. For Black students, white students, Latinos, it's important for all students, and especially important for students of color, who very often thrive in classrooms led by teachers who share their racial and cultural background. Unfortunately, in public schools across the country, students of color, students from low-income communities face inequities in access and assignment to strong and diverse educators. While students of color make up close to 50% of K-12 public school student population, teachers of color make up less than 20%. And the gaps in representation are particularly wide for Latino students. Over 25% of US students are Latino, compared to fewer than 10% of teachers. Access is also very much an issue. 40% of the nation's public schools do not have a single teacher of color on record. And in many states, Black and Latino students attend schools without a single teacher who matches their race or ethnicity. So there's work to be done. We need strong advocacy on this, but we also need the power of research and data to drive that advocacy. As I mentioned before, we've been doing work in North Carolina for a number of years with a number of partners. And I'm excited that both Eric and Lynn are going to be able to talk to you about that work and what it looks like, where we can learn from where we've been and what we can keep in mind with the pandemic recovery. We're going to talk a bit more about how that looks like in North Carolina. And so I'm so excited that you all get to meet two of my amazing colleagues in the work and the journey with me, Eric Duncan and Lynn Jennings. Eric is our senior P12 data and policy analyst, and he's been at the forefront leading our research on how states can better support, recruit, and retain teachers of color. And Lynn serves as EdTrust Senior Director of National and State Partnerships. I've always said we need to get a new title because it's very long. And she works closely with our coalitions in the 14 states and beyond that we work with. Lynn also, I've always said that our team is full of advocates, and they truly are, whether they have a Ph.D. after their name, or they work in accounting, or they're at the front desk. They all are amazing advocates on behalf of students. But Lynn, I give a lot of credit to. I worked alongside her when I was on the Hill, and her ability to understand community and be able to lift community has always been incredibly powerful. And I'm super happy that she's joining me. So they're going to give some additional context to our work, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions. And in fact, I'm going to be asking them some tough questions. So I'm really looking forward to that. So Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Denise. Such an honor to be here. Appreciate you all having us. I am a Wake Forest grad, so sorry to offend any of you Dukies, but nothing but love for North Carolina. As Denise said, we've been working pretty hard on elevating this issue of educator diversity. We think it's at the core of educational equity and ensuring that students of color and students from low-income backgrounds have the best opportunity for education. And like Denise framed so well, that's sort of where we're what we prioritize. The slide that you see here is one of the data and policy profiles that we at the national office at EdTrust have created. And this is for North Carolina. And so, Lynn is going to talk about some of the advocates that we've had the pleasure of working with, and some of the folks at the state level who have been really strong advocates for changing some of the data that we see here. But I just wanted to sort of put this in the context and share this resource with you all about the state of educator diversity in North Carolina. As Denise said, the DRIVE Task Force led by the governor's office was so vital in setting an agenda. And a lot of the recommendations that were put forward there in the data, I'm repeating through this slide, but just to put in the context, while there's the commitment at the state level to really increase the diversity of the workforce, we still have a pretty sizable gap between teachers of color and students of color. And Denise brought up the access point. Again, we're about closing opportunity gaps. What we really are looking for is, based on the research and data that we've seen, do students of color have access to same-race teachers? And based on this gap and based on some additional research, we see that far too often students of color who benefit so greatly from having a same-race teacher aren't afforded those opportunities, particularly in elementary school, and I can talk more about that a little later, where for Black students, having just one Black teacher increases the likelihood that that student will attend and graduate from college. So it's such a vital issue, particularly at this time. As I said, you'll see it on this slide. There's sort of 5 areas in the policy space that we really focus on. The first 2 are about data transparency from the state level and setting goals and strategies. to increase the diversity of the workforce. We've talked about the Drive Task Force, and we also want to highlight that North Carolina does pretty well from a data transparency perspective. The Department of Public Instruction has led the way in various meetings we've had, talking about building data systems that are accessible to stakeholders and allow advocates to work alongside decision makers and policymakers and practitioners to increase the diversity of the workforce based on the needs that have been elevated by the transparent data. So we're really encouraged by that. But at the same time, with the other three, where we look at investments in teacher preparation programs, where right now North Carolina enrolls about 81% of their student population in teacher prep programs are white. We see that there's sort of work that can be done, and a lot of recommendations elevated by the Drive Task Force align with that. So investments in scholarships and loan forgiveness programs that specifically target educators of color and help to build wealth, investing in other areas of preparation and holding preparation programs accountable. We, again, been elevated by the Drive Task Force, and something that we looked at in North Carolina. And then recruitment, that's sort of the fourth criteria that we looked at, where states are targeting resources to help schools and districts recruit more educators of color. And we see that that's a major issue, where things like Grow Your Own programs, Teachers Academy, or teacher academies have been successful in recruiting candidates of color. That's something that North Carolina has stepped into, but can do a little bit more. And then one big issue that we've talked about, and I'm sure most of us have heard about this, is specific teacher shortages. And so retaining teachers, particularly teachers of color who are affected disproportionately by turnover and conditions that have led to them leaving the classroom, is so important. And the pandemic has exacerbated that. We've seen that both from data and anecdotally when we've held webinars with teachers of color who have talked about the burnout, talked about how hard it is to teach in these conditions, and the lack of support that they often face being teachers of color, and often teachers of color in their own one of the only on record. And so, we've tried to elevate these policy areas, share both what states can do better, and also share the promising practices, like I said, elevating the great data transparency that North Carolina has led on. And so, again, there's work to be done, and we're spotlighting what's happening in North Carolina and trying to provide example for both this state and others on ways to do this work. And one of those areas that we've continued to work on under the leadership of Lynn is connecting with advocates at the state level. So I will turn it over to her and look forward to continuing this conversation with Denise and Lynn.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric and Denise. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I am, next slide, please. I'm here to talk about, we have the data, we have the research. So how do we get to the change? How do we make sure we're having impact? And this slide says why advocacy, and it could just as easily say why partnerships. Because of that trust, advocacy and partnerships, they go hand in hand. That's how we get the work done, is that we do it with the people who are the communities most impacted by policy change, those who have lived years and years under an education system that perhaps ignored them, rendered them invisible when it comes to data, felt excluded, all of those things that we're pushing to change. We want to make sure that they're part of conversations. And then we just know that there's so many advocates on the ground level and across the country who are very much interested in social justice and racial justice change. So largely our partnerships team, that's what we're about, is how do we make these connections between the policy, the data, and the people to make sure that we're all, as much as we can, moving together with achieving more education justice, and more education equity in our systems. How this partnerships work, and I'm just going to do like a broad range because we'll get into more detail, is that often we find ourselves working with Definitely students. They're very important to us. We also work with advocacy groups, civil rights groups, human rights groups, educators, families, parents. We actually had a parent fellowship program here in North Carolina. And like I said, anybody else, any other organizations who share some of our same goals and priorities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So again, I'm going to go into what does EdTrust bring and what do we, particularly as a national organization, what do we see as part of our value add and, oh, you went ahead of me right there. Our value add and what we very much do when we're working, especially in the 14 states where we say we have a deeper dive, deeper engagement, sustained relationship with partners. What do we do? And I would say we do three main things. We convene, we share, and we support. And by convene, I mean we bring advocates together. This slide shows something that we've become known for, particularly in the equity space. Twice a year, we bring advocates from across the country together to meet each other, form a network, find out what's working, what strategies folks are using in order to push for change. In our October, I think it was October boot camp, we had over 300 advocates that came from across 35 states. And so this is our opportunity to start building, because we very much want to build a network in order we can build a movement towards making, educational justice. So this is our part of our movement building. Second thing I said we did is definitely share. And this is where we're able to share what's happening in the field, the data, the research that's happening, all the great work from our EdTrust team, folks like Eric, along with a lot of the work that our partners are doing. So we think it's important that people know, advocates know, they often know that what they want to fight for, but making sure that they have the evidence that they need, the data that they need to ground their argument and make their case for the fight. And then the third is definitely for EdTrust, we support. Often we find ourselves being the backbone or being very much in the behind the scenes for our coalition work. It's because we have a team that can do a lot of the data research, but we can also do quite a bit of the advocacy training and the prep that folks need. So for instance, what we were able to do with our partners is a lot around media training, how to write an op-ed, how to, we get asked often when I'm going to meet with my state legislator, what do I do in that 5 minutes? And we give training around that. We also help them prepare action toolkits, advocacy toolkits. And all of these things, when we really think about what we want to do in partnerships, is to make sure that at these decision-making tables, the people who are most impacted are sitting at those tables, they have a seat at the table, they're prepared to be at the tables, along with that they're definitely heard. So don't just invite us, make sure that we're heard when we're there. Next slide. And then the third, this is a slide, again, I'm going back to impact. And when I mentioned we work, we have some sustained work that we do with coalitions in 14 states. And what I wasn't able to put on this slide yet is North Carolina. And I say yet because we're very much working on a new project that I'm excited to talk about today. Denise and Eric both mentioned that we have worked in North Carolina at least about 4 or 5 years. At our boot camps, we've often had 1 to 2 tables of advocates from North Carolina, people who wanted to work together on issues from funding to teacher diversity. And we've been able to do that kind of work with those advocates. But we have a lot of push around teacher diversity and educator diversity. We work with organizations from the Hunt Institute to Best NC to the Urban Leagues. I'm sure I'm missing some groups, Creed. I can name several partners, Profound Gentlemen, several partners that we've worked with and how we can get together and be very strategic in how to advance the work that has started in North Carolina around teacher diversity to advance it even more. To get even more specific, what that looks like, about a year or so ago, don't get me on my timeline, but I think it's about a year or so ago, these groups got together, and when the Governor's Commission was coming together around teacher diversity, they would meet and discuss, what do we want to present? What do we support? What kind of questions do we have? And they were able to have those conversations, not just with each other, but also with the Governor's Task Force. And we'll see that a lot of what they were recommending and suggesting is very much reflected in the recommendations that eventually came out. And so we want to continue that work. And what we realized when we were having those conversations, that one group that wasn't there, that were not in these conversations as we thought they should be represented, were educators of color. So here's the project that I was saying I'm excited about. We recently started a formal partnership with an organization, We Are. It's a racial justice organization that is partnering with us so that we can do leadership training, the data and the policy training, the advocacy training for educators of color, so that they're at these tables and listen to when we're talking about teacher diversity. From the research, we know that not only do we have to get teachers in the classrooms, but keep them there. And that's affected by what they're able to do in the schools, the culture and the climate. And so how do you have those conversations? You have to have the people who are impacted in those conversations. So those are the kind of things that we're looking to do with partners. And that's what we want to do with this new partnership that we have with We Are. So we're putting together programming now for that. We'll have a larger convening and bring teachers from across the state of North Carolina together this summer. And then we'll come out with what they see as being important parts of the conversation that need to be uplifted, and the important parts of the conversation that may not have gotten enough attention, or we might just have a blind spot to because we're just not seeing it. And so this is very much how our partners inform our work, inform our research, and make us stronger partners for them as they move forward. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to pass it back over to Denise so we can get to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Eric. Great presentations, obviously. Oops.
Sounds like he agrees.
And my dog. And my dog agrees. Yes. Let's hope we can get through this without embarking. Probably not. I'm hoping, I apologize, folks. Work from home. I wanted to engage Lynn and Eric in a few questions about the work, because the work we've been doing over a number of years has really evolved. But Eric, could you talk to us a little bit more about, you provided, sorry about that. You provided really powerful stats in your comments about the state of diversity in the educator workforce. Could you go a little deeper about the why? Like, why does this matter for student learning and student well-being?
Absolutely. And I see your dog fed you that question, so I appreciate his contribution to it as well. But to your point, I mean, this issue is so important. Teachers are the most significant in-school factor that contributes to student learning. So having a strong teacher workforce, having great teachers is extremely important. And it's a lever that states, districts, and schools can really push on to increase student achievement. But in doubling down on the diversity issue, when we talk about a strong teacher workforce, we mean diversity because of all the research that points to how important it is to have diverse teachers in a diverse teacher workforce, particularly for students of color. So I mentioned some of the research that said that for Black students, having just one elementary school teacher that is a Black teacher matches their race makes them more likely to finish college, to attend and finish college. So just that aspect alone shows the direct impact that having same-race teachers and access to same-race teachers can have on academic achievement. But there are a variety of other areas that this impacts. So we at EdTrust, we look at things like discipline referral. if students are being suspended, expelled, and exclusionary discipline practices are applied, they can't learn. It's obviously really important. So we see data that shows that having a same-race teacher decreases the likelihood for students of color of them being suspended, expelled, excluded, and ultimately, like we talk about with the school-to-prison pipeline, it allows a better opportunity to not end up being a part of a criminal justice system or some of the really negative outcomes we see with exclusionary discipline practices. Access to advanced coursework. We have a body of work because it's so important for all students to have access to advanced coursework, to have rigorous coursework. We see that for a student of color, having a same-race teacher increases their likelihood that they will be referred to coursework or advanced coursework and the opportunities to get the college credits that they need to get that leg up so that they're able to achieve in their career. Student attendance, something as important and meaningful as that, it increases student attendance for students of color to have same-race teachers. So it has such an impact on so many areas, and we're really happy with all the research that has illuminated some of these direct connections to having a same-race teacher.
Thank you for that. On the other thing that we've dug into, and I think this is something should be entered into the conversation, is part of our power in convening is giving voice to those who don't traditionally have a voice in policy. And so, Eric, you've done a lot of work over the past couple of years, listening to teachers, hearing teachers, convening teachers, and I know you're now even working on another convening. Can you speak more to that and what will it look like and what do you hope for its outcome?
Absolutely. Lynn touched on this a little bit as well, so I'm really appreciative of that. To your point, Denise, I think one of our big theories of change is that educators, particularly educators of color, have so much insight, knowledge, expertise, passion about these issues and can be real change agents. And every opportunity we've had to connect with them, we've gotten such great information that we've been able to spread to other advocates in the field. And so consistently at my time at EdTrust, I've had the opportunity to interview educators of color, talk to them about their experiences, things like working in COVID and some of the disproportionate challenges that they've had and faced, issues of retention, in what they believe are some of the levers that need to be sort of invested on and pushed to increase the diversity of the workforce and keep teachers in the classroom. And so because of that, and because of how strong they've advocated for change, systems level change, how knowledgeable they are, we're trying to build stronger networks of educators of color in different states in order to get that information from them, advance some of their sort of priorities, and help them have a better seat at the table. So the event that you just mentioned is an extension of the Hidden Heroes convening that we had in 2019 that was extremely successful, where we brought teams of educators of color from across the country to create plans and to increase the diversity of their workforce and increase student achievement. So we're trying to do a part two of that and lay the infrastructure in place in each of these states to continue supporting those educators of color in their states, to create those state networks like the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance that has been so successful in implementing policy in Tennessee and who we've assisted, like the Massachusetts Equity group that we've worked with, who also has just recently instituted or helped to pass a policy in Massachusetts to increase the diversity of the workforce. So we're looking to have that convening and sustain that engagement with educators of color in multiple states so that we can continue to lean on them to provide their knowledge, their expertise, their passion, and that they can be advocates on the ground to advance state level and district level policies to increase the diversity of the workforce.
Thanks, Eric. Lynn, I want to turn to you for a moment and really appreciated your presentation. Why do you think, having done this work for such a long time, that advocates are so hungry for research and data, but not, I guess everybody could be providing research and data, but research and data and learnings from practice with a race equity lens? Why do you think they're calling for that?
Well, that's a tough question, Denise, but I think I think one I can think of two reasons. The first is definitely what the research and data offers is it gives them something that they already know. You know, it's almost like I know this is happening in my school. I know this is happening to my children, but I don't have the numbers, or I don't seem to have the information I need to make the case for why we need to do something different, you know? And actually, I think very much of some of the work we did here in North Carolina with our family fellows. We worked with families, parents of mostly Black parents, and their children were at the intersection between race and also having disabilities, students with disabilities. And being able to have EdTrust come in and be able to show these are the ways you can read the data, this is what's missing from the data, and this is the kinds of questions you want to ask in order to get to, are your children getting the supports that they need? This may be the reason why they're not part of an IEP program as they should be. This is what happens when you become part of the more a part of the disciplinary system, and why they're getting sent to that they need behavioral issues, and there's something else that's not being seen. So I think that that's definitely part of it. It's finally like, okay, I knew this was true. I thought this was true. You've confirmed it, and we see it on a wider scale, so we can make a change for it. So and then what happens when you're able to do this, and this is the second part, is once you're able to do that, then you feel more confident to go demand the change that you want. You will be heard in a very different way, and that's just because that's the way power works, and we often know how decisions get made and influenced.
Thank you, Lynn. And then my last question, and then I'll turn it back to Leslie. With the work, Lynn, at a time when our families, our advocates, our teachers, our students are working so hard to both just maintain, what are you hopeful about?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of fatigue out there, but what I'm hopeful about, you know, when I get to hear and work directly with advocates, their resilience and their wanting to work together and wanting to collaborate, it always makes me hopeful. You know, it's like we're able to cut through some of the stuff happening in Washington and in other places, and really want to say, what can we do to make something happen now for students and children? And this the commitment to that. That's why I'm hopeful, and that's what helps me get up every day and come to work.
Thank you, my dear colleagues. I'm going to ask Leslie to rejoin us.
Thank you so much, Denise and Eric and Lynn. That was a fantastic presentation on your work, and thank you for giving us some insight into the kinds of things that you do with some nice on-the-ground examples, and especially your focus on sharing what you're doing in North Carolina. We've had a couple of people writing into the Q&A about how excited they are that you're working with We Are, which is right here in Durham. So we really appreciate those local examples. I like your ending on the note of what are you hopeful about, and starting with that note about this is a time of opportunity, given the focus on education. So those are all really fantastic. You've given us some really good examples of how you bring policy, data, and people together, especially your focus on giving voice to people who don't have a voice. Do you have other examples of that can give us a flavor of the kind of work that you do? I know you've mentioned, Eric, bringing together teachers of color, and then we just heard a little bit about families. Are there other examples of voices that you try to elevate, which are really important in this current conversation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, Lynn has way more than I do, but just two I want to bring out. We, much like North Carolina is facing its state funding formula challenges, Maryland went through a significant battle over the past 3 years trying to increase the amount of funding that would go to students and academic achievement and performance across the state. One challenge, as someone put it earlier in the Q&A, is, it's not just how much money, but it's also how well you spend it and what are those levers for bringing systemic change. At the Education Trust, we've done a lot of work on thinking about resource equity. What are the dimensions of equity we should be thinking about? It is about teachers. It is about school climate. It is about access to advanced coursework. It is about early childhood. So we were able to work closely with an existing coalition on the ground, of which we're one of the key partners, to develop a strategy where we would use our advocacy to help educate members of the State House and Senate to identify what those levers could be, what we would be using the money for. And I'm really pleased to say that our advocates worked with legislators to submit 100-some amendments during the process. And a significant number of those amendments were accepted. And we now see investments in teacher diversity, early childhood, a lot of school climate work. So that's exactly the way we want to do it. And now we're focusing on implementation. We have the dollars. It's now in the different areas we want. Now we need to make sure it's done with fidelity and that the dollars are targeted the communities who need it most. So Maryland's a great current example. Something very similar happened in Massachusetts. And in our higher ed work, which I think is increasingly just amazing, we recently established a cohort of justice fellows who are formerly incarcerated and individuals who we've brought into the policy family to help them. They are the voice of what needs to happen to give access to returning folks, even those who are currently in the system now that the Pell ban has been lifted, the federal ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals is now gone. We were active in that engagement as well at the federal level. But these fellows, the 8 of them, are about to release at the end of this month an amazing scan of states and how states are, what barriers they have to obtaining quality education. What does it mean when you need your credits transferred, when you're in the system and then you exit the system? What are some of the different supports that students need when they're in the system to be able to continue their education? So I'm super excited about that. We had 2 of our fellows come and present at our staff meeting, and everybody was like all aflutter. So it's those kind of initiatives that we believe bring voice to the work, bring voice to the policy. And I think the Justice Fellows work, hearing from teachers that Eric does, convening the various communities who are not at the table, who are not able to participate in policymaking, but giving them the way in and the skills and the language, which, it's their language. We just want to make sure people could hear it. So, that's some of the amazing work that this team has done over 25 years.
Yeah, thank you so much. That really is amazing work. How can you envision those of us in higher ed, and especially at Duke University, getting more involved in your work? What are some opportunities for partnership? And along that same note, one of our attendees has also asked, how could I get more involved with the work of EdTrust? What are the avenues for that?
So glad you asked. Come join us. We are actively recruiting. So that's one way. When you are done with your policy program, we would love to talk to you. 2, I'm going to open the door to Lynn and Eric, who are doing, and we have another person doing work in North Carolina. We can get you information and their personal contacts. But we would love to. We are always eager to find more partners, eager to expand our partners, bring them into a coalition and work together. So as I told Leslie earlier, I don't think I have any Duke people on my staff, and I would really like to change that. So much to Eric's chagrin and some other Tar Heels, but let's make that happen.
Also come to our boot camps. Yeah, come
That's right. Oh yeah, and we can also love to extend the invitation to come to our biannual boot camps. We're figuring out whether we're going to be in person this year, but would love to have you there.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. When is the next one in North Carolina?
We're hoping to do one in Memphis this spring, which most likely will be hybrid. So there will be the ability to join us there. And then we're hoping, Eric is hoping to do a convening in North Carolina. Is that right, Eric?
I guess so, since I was led into this, but both by Leslie and Denise. It sounds like that's going to happen. So we'll figure something out.
Well, I certainly think a lot of folks who are joining us today and who are excited about the work that you're doing would love to learn more about that and opportunities for engagement. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I know we're getting close to time here. So I want to say once again, thank you so much to Denise Forte, Lynn Jennings, and Eric Duncan for sharing your important work with the Education Trust with our audience. And I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight to engage in this important discussion. Before we close, though, I want to mention that I'd like to invite you all to a national online conference that we're hosting in April as part of the Sanford School's 50th anniversary. And the conference is going to focus on universal systems that provide young children and their families with opportunities to thrive. We have a lot of great speakers lined up for that day. So look for the link in the chat. Eric is going to post the link for us to register for that event. We also have a quick evaluation survey, so you can let us know what you thought about this event today. If you could click on that link and answer a few quick questions about the event, that'll help us very much. Thank you again to our speakers for a wonderful discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us and engaging in the Q&A. And have a good night, everyone.